You said this. You said the question isn't whether members of the Trump campaign conspired with Russia to sway the 2016 elections. We already know they did. How did you know that before the report even came out?
We had seen multiple indictments as well as prosecutions and convictions of people associated with Russia.
But shouldn't normally someone who's heading up the Constitution Society, don't you normally wait until an investigation's over? Isn't, in this great nation, people are presumed to be innocent until proven otherwise, and you were already making a finding, stating a finding as the head of the American Constitution Society before we even had the report by the special counsel's office.
There was quite a lot of evidence already in the record, and I think the Mueller report then goes further to lay out multiple instances of contacts between Trump
But what's
administration.
interesting, you just mentioned the Mueller report. What's interesting is that same day that you said the question isn't whether the members of the Trump campaign conspired with Russia to sway the elections. We already know they did, even though we didn't know that because the report wasn't done. That same day, you wrote an op-ed. You just mentioned the Mueller report, but you wrote an op-ed that same day, March 22nd, 2019, where you said, we don't need to read the Mueller report. And now you're telling us we do. So before the report came out, before Bill Barr said anything, you said, we already know he's guilty, and oh, by the way, don't read the report.
Sir,
Now you're telling us we should read the report?
The point was a rhetorical one, that there is already so much evidence out there
That's
that
not what
Congress
the
needs to
right
examine.
here. We don't need to read the Mueller report. You wrote that, right?
I didn't write the title, actually. If you read the body of the opinion piece, you will see that it says Congress needs to get this report. So,
well, here's what you wrote there. Well, just second paragraph. Mr. Mueller's report may never go public, but we don't need a peek at the recommendations anyway. So did you write that?
I did.
Okay, so you did. But now you're telling us we should read the report?
I do. Yes, there's much more in there.
Let's read the report on page 2.
We knew a fair amount already, but now we know more. And I think Congress needs to actually see the full report and the evidence underlying it. And
let's read the report. Let's read the report.
Understand how Russia interfered in our elections, which, again, I will state, I think it's troubling that your side of the aisle doesn't seem to want to examine.
I think it's troubling that the head of the American Constitution Society said, we already know that he did something before the report was final. Now you're telling us to read the report, and I'm going to read it on page 2. Page 2. The investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. So now that first you said don't read the report, now you're saying read the report. I'm reading the report, and it directly contradicts what you said as the head of the American Constitution Society. And of course, the Democrats think it's fine and appropriate to have the head of the American Constitution Society come in here and lecture us today and tell us today how we need to move towards impeachment. I mean, I fail to get it. I fail to get it. So what do you say about that sentence right there on page 2, that now that you've changed your mind and say we should read the report, where Bob Mueller says, the special counsel's office says, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities.
Well, I think it's unfortunate that you actually haven't read the opinion piece, which does say that Congress needs to see the full Mueller report. That is what the opinion piece says.
We're talking about what you wrote, what you said, and what Bob Mueller said. You said don't read the report.
Exactly what the opinion piece says, that Congress needs to get the full Mueller report.
I think, Mr. Chairman, here's what's interesting. Here's what's interesting. We have a witness today who, before the Mueller report was out, said, we already know the president's guilty. Before Bill Barr issued his first statement on the report, says, we already know he's guilty. That same day that she said those things, she writes an op-ed piece saying, don't read the Mueller report, because if you do, you'll find out what she claimed is absolutely not true.
I would actually,
and she's an expert witness
once again, would recommend that you actually read the piece so that you can see what it
I read
says.
your piece. I read the whole darn
Apparently
thing.
not, because it does
I
say
did just
that
a few
Congress...
minutes ago, because I remember the exchange we had a few months ago right after Bill Barr had sent his March 24th letter, and we had a little discussion about this same fact. I can't believe the Democrats invited you back.
As I said, it's really unfortunate that you don't actually bother to read beyond the title.
Mr. Chairman, I got 20 seconds. I got 4 seconds. I did read, and you know what? I did not follow her advice. I read the Mueller report. She's telling people not to. Yields back. Chair recognizes himself. Madam Chair, why are you harassing Twitter?
Congressman, thanks for the question. As you might know, the FTC's work on Twitter goes back a decade. Back in 2009.
I'm not talking about a decade. I'm talking about now. 12 demand letters in 10 weeks, over 350 separate requests you've demanded of Twitter. Why are you harassing them?
Twitter has a history of lax security and privacy policies.
You've asked for every single communication relating to Elon Musk, not communications that he just sent to someone or communications he received, but any time he's mentioned. That actually seems more than harassment. That seems like almost an obsession. Why such an intense focus?
So, Congressman, again, it was found that Twitter's lax privacy policies allowed unauthorized users to co-opt Twitter accounts, including that of Fox News. Subsequently, Twitter voluntarily entered into a consent order with the FTC.
Here's what you wrote in December. Madam Chair, here's what you wrote in December. Identify all journalists and other members of the media to whom Twitter has granted access since Musk bought the company. You want to know the name of every journalist a private company has talked to? Think that's consistent with the First Amendment?
Congressman, as a former journalist, I take extremely seriously the valuable work that they do and understand that there can be instances in which government action is unjustifiably
particularly, Madam Chair, if I could just interject, particularly in the context here. I mean, it's bad enough if you got government asking a private company about who are the journalists you're talking to, you name 4 of them and say, we want the other names of any journalists you may in fact be communicating with. That's bad enough, and I think a threat to the First Amendment, freedom of the press. But in the context of giving us information about how government had suppressed speech on these platforms, that's the context you're asking for. I think that's particularly troubling, don't you?
Congressman, the consent decree that we have prohibits Twitter from sharing personal information with third parties. When we read in the papers, like everybody else, that Twitter may have granted access to third parties, that's what our teams were seeking information about. Again, this is a company whose history with the FTC goes back
Chair,
a decade.
We got limited time. Madam Chair, who is David Roque?
Could you repeat that, Congressman?
David Roque, R-O-Q-U-E. Who is David Roque?
I'm not familiar with
You
that.
deposed him last month, June 21st, 2023. David Roque is the independent partner for Ernst & Young's independent assessment of Twitter's program. That's part of this consent decree. Do you know what Mr. Roque said in that deposition?
I'm not aware.
Okay, let me read it for you then, because I think it's pretty important. Mr. Roque testified, again, in front of your lawyers, you deposed him, testified that FTC's conduct made him feel as if the FTC was trying to influence the outcome of the engagement before it had started. He said, in some of the discussions that we were having with the Federal Trade Commission, expectations were being conveyed about what those results should be before we had even begun any procedures. So they're the independent assessor in this consent decree the FTC has with Twitter, and you're telling the guy who is the person. He's the guy. He's Joe the accountant who's going to get this information. You're telling him, you're putting your finger on the scale, telling him what you want the outcome to be, and he's supposed to be the independent fact finder. Why are you doing that?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with those.
Because it was just filed today, but we are. This is filed in court today, and this is your deposition.
I'm happy to take a closer look at it and be back in touch. I will say, as a general matter, we want to make sure that the assessors and auditors that are responsible for overseeing compliance are doing their job.
You're saying Mr. Roque's line, what he testified here, what's been filed in court today, that there were suggestions of what they would expect the outcome to be, they being the FTC, there were suggestions of what they wanted him to go find in his independent assessment of the consent decree agreement between the FTC and Twitter.
Again, I'm happy to take a close look and we can be back in touch with you about that allegation, but our staff are consummate professionals. When they conduct these investigations, they're focused on determining whether there was a violation.
Is your attack on Twitter, harassment on Twitter, is that based on the fact that all kinds of Democrats have asked you to do this and frankly some things that you've written about dealing with, quote, disinformation? Does that have anything to do with it, Ms. Khan?
Congressman, we make only independent determinations about whether there were law violations.
The statement from Chairman Nadler, the statements from the letter, the press release and the letter from 7 Democrat senators that had no impact on it, that's not why you're doing it?
Absolutely not. We look very closely at the specific matter at hand. Again,
12 demand letters in 10 weeks telling the independent assessor, hey, put your finger on the scale, this is the results we want. That's not harassment, and it had nothing to do with the fact that every Democrat in this town seemed to be telling you to go after Twitter.
Our focus is on protecting people's privacy and security. Twitter has sensitive data on 150 million Americans, including private messages. We need to make sure, especially given its history going all the way back to 2010, we're doing everything to make sure Twitter is complying with the order.
That's fine. Don't put your finger on the scale. and don't attack the First Amendment and the rights of journalists. Thank the gentleman for yielding. Ms. Khan, earlier, and I believe the gentleman from Arizona brought this up, you said people's privacy is paramount. I couldn't agree more. And as we talked earlier, I do think there's bipartisan support to deal with that, this sweeping up of data that happens, and scarier yet is FBI purchasing that data.